It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us back on the show to talk a little bit about Catholicism in U.S. history is Father Charles Connor. Thanks for being here, Father Connor.
Oh, thank you for having me, Kyle. I appreciate it.
It's great to have you here. What's your favorite part of history?
That's kind of a difficult question because there's really no part that I would say is unenjoyable. I've been reading and teaching it all my life, so I guess I just have to say the whole bit of it.
Well, that's awesome. When we had you on previously, like a year and a half ago, you were talking about Catholic priests during the founding of the United States, Revolutionary War. A lot of the book focuses on the anti-Catholic sentiments of Americans at the time. So can you give us a little summary of how Catholicism was viewed and treated in the early years of our country?
Oh, well, it's probably better to what was the way it was treated in the early years of the country became even more intensified as we move into the early 19th century because the story progresses there as the Catholic immigrant population begins to grow in the United States. And with the arrival of both the Irish and the German Catholics, swelling the eastern seaboard, and in the case of the Irish and the large Midwestern cities, in the case of the Germans, you had the reaction of the native-borns, those who had been here for so long, and that would give rise in the 1840s to the Native American Party, and in the 1850s to the Know Nothing Party. And so what you have really is tons of anti-Catholic literature and loads of stump orators, generally Protestant ministers or intense Protestants of one kind or another. And finally, of course, you even had the outbreak of violence in places like Charlestown, Massachusetts, and in the Kensington section of Philadelphia, and at least threatened violence, which thank God did not come about in New York City. But in any event, all of these things really kept repeating themselves, if you will, throughout all of United States history. It proved the dictum that Arthur Schlesinger Sr. said years and years ago, that anti-Catholicism is indeed the most deeply seated bias in the American people. Mm-hmm. And it just seems that statement is proven true over and over again.
And so the book that we're talking about today, Faith and Fury, focuses on the Civil War, but you start with some of the things leading up to the Civil War. Can you talk about what was going on in the country and how Catholics were involved with that, maybe for better or for worse?
Sure. Well, there's a positive and a negative side as you lead up to the Civil War. I mean, the positive side, obviously, was the increase in immigration, and with that increase in immigration came the tremendous expansion of the physical plant of the Catholic Church all over the country, really, in a real sense. In addition to that, though, there was the whole question of sectionalism, and sectionalism was growing because there was a significant difference in two different philosophies of government. Many people, for example, will say that the Civil War was fought over slavery. In point of fact, it was not fought over slavery. Slavery was just simply the issue, a very significant issue, obviously, but it was the issue which underscored two different theories of government, the organic versus the compact theory of government. And what you had, of course, with that organic theory, which would be very prevalent here in the North, was the idea that 13 states had come together initially, and they had given the federal government what is prescribed in the Constitution as expressed, enumerated, delegated, and implied powers. And anything above and beyond that, the residual powers were left to the states. Well, that would be the organic theory. The compact theory of government, of course, did not view things in that vein at all. They said that all power and authority really rested in the states to begin with, and it was just through the beneficence of the states that they extended this power to a federal government that they had created. But, if that federal government in any way, shape, or form was taking actions contrary to the thinking that was prevalent in the very concept of state sovereignty, then those states had a right and indeed even an obligation to withdraw from the federal union. So this is what really started coming about in the mid-19th century. And for that reason, obviously North and South went to battle over it. But they were not battling per se over slavery. They were battling over these two theories of government. Now, I don't mean the enlisted men who were getting killed were thinking about theories of government. They were thinking about patriotism, obviously, to whatever part of the country, or from whatever part of the country they may have come. But, the undergirding issue here was a very, very different way to look at government. Now, as regards, however, the question of slavery, that would be, I think, very important to this discussion as well, because the Catholic Church over the centuries and through the pronouncements of many, many popes had strongly condemned slavery and the slave trade. What happened here in the United States, which was the last holdout really in the civilized world to maintain an institution like slavery, was the fact that slavery had become such an accepted social institution really since the days of Jamestown, Virginia, the first British colony. Certainly church leaders were very, very, very reluctant to rock the boat and start advocating the overthrow of an accepted social way of life that took care of people from the cradle to the grave and gave people employment and all the rest of it. The interesting thing was also that what we're talking about here is obviously but let me just retract for a minute. The Catholic bishops, and by them I mean primarily John Hughes of New York, Bishop John England of Charleston somewhat earlier, and Archbishop Francis Patrick Kenrick of Baltimore. They were the ones who wrote most extensively on this subject. They would always differentiate between the slave trade, which is the buying and selling of human beings, which was grossly, grossly immoral, and the institution itself. What they concentrated on was the obligation of Catholic slave owners to raise their slaves in the faith, give them the rudiments of truth, the sacraments, make sure they were validly married in the church. And all this was not necessarily an easy task by any means for a variety of reasons. But we're talking here about an institution, obviously, that did in fact hold human beings in bondage. And the first people who were very, very quick to rise up and become the most vocal in their opposition were the abolitionists. And we always talk about New Year's Day, 1830, being the birth of the abolitionist movement, because it was the date on which the first issue of The Liberator, which was edited by William Lloyd Garrison, came on the shelves, so to speak, the market. Well, the abolitionists, as I say, were decrying this system that held human beings in bondage. But at the very same time, those same abolitionists just as strongly decried a system which held people spiritually in bondage. And that system, of course, was the Catholic Church. And so people do not often realize the intense anti-Catholicism of these abolitionists. You think, for example, of people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in Brunswick, Maine. Her husband, Calvin Stowe, was a professor of theology at Bowdoin College. Her father, Lyman Beecher, was a minister and probably one of the most strident and vocal anti-Catholics of his time. So, I mean, the Catholic Church wouldn't touch the issue of slavery because they would feel that they were being perceived in the public mind as siding with the abolitionists, and they weren't going to side with the abolitionists on anything because they knew how much the abolitionists detested the Catholic Church. So it gets to be a very confused kind of a situation, but makes for an interesting story for sure.
Yeah. We're talking with Father Charles Connor about his book, Faith and Fury, The Rise of Catholicism During the Civil War. And whenever we're talking about the rise of Catholicism, in what ways was Catholicism on the rise? Oh,
it was on the rise for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was on the rise physically in terms of numbers. They kept increasing with every passing year. It was also on the rise, as I mentioned earlier, with the growth of the physical plant of the church, and it certainly was on the rise with the opportunity, particularly in the war years, that Catholics had to assert themselves and to prove their patriotism, whether it be to the North or with the South, by their valiant efforts of fighting in both the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And it was on the rise too, in the sense that as more years went by, you had the rise of Catholics who were doing well financially, Catholics doing well in the area of politics, being elected senators and governors and this kind of thing, Catholic editors becoming very, very well known for their publications. You also had, certainly during the war, another thing that really changed a lot of attitudes on the Catholic Church was the intense work of the nursing sisters. I'm thinking particularly of Mother Seton's Sisters of Charity here in Emmitsburg and several other communities of sisters in the country as well. They brought many of the soldiers back to the faith. They increased the number of men, in the sense of being responsible for many conversions of the soldiers to Catholicism and so forth. So it was on the rise that way, in the sense that we were increasing. And certainly by mid-century too, you also had an American version of the Oxford movement in England, which brought so many people in England into the faith, and that had an effect here in the States as well. So even as early as 20 years, let's say, before the actual fighting broke out of the Civil War, you do have an American version of the Oxford movement, and therefore very conspicuous conversions to Catholicism. So there's all kinds of ways in which the church was on the rise, I would think.
So what would you say are some of the key takeaways or lessons that we should learn when looking back at history in the Catholic Church during the time of the Civil War?
Well, probably the biggest lesson to be learned is that while it was a period in which the church was able to assert itself, Cardinal Newman's dictum here is always very much on target, that no sooner have we finished singing our Alleluias than we begin chanting our Misereres. In other words, the whole story of history is an ebb and flow. You get into the Reconstruction years, of course, and you have conspicuous Catholics like Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where John Wilkes Booth and the conspirators met to plan to abduct and to kill Lincoln. And you had Dr. Samuel Mudd down in southern Maryland, who repaired the wounds of Booth, although he always claimed Booth was in disguise and he did not recognize him and so forth. Well, these were conspicuous Catholics, did not make the church look good in many people's eyes. And as you move just a few years beyond that, you have the whole question of Bible reading in the public schools. And by then Ulysses S. Grant is president, and he's decrying any kind of federal funding for Catholic schools and talking about how divisive Catholic schools are in the country. And so the lesson to be learned is that victories are often Pyrrhic victories, I think, and that they're short-lasting, so to speak. And it seems we find ourselves in another calamitous kind of a situation. And so the story is always gone in the United States.
Yeah. Well, you've got so much in here. You've got a whole chapter on the church and slavery. You've got a chapter on the Irish contribution and a chapter on Reconstruction. So people need to check this out. Where's the best place to get a copy of the book?
Oh, I'd say most Catholic bookstores carry it. Sophia Institute Press, EWTN Press, and certainly also on Amazon. So you got Amazon, you got EWTN, you got Sophia Institute Press, and you have any number of Catholic bookstores around the country.
All right. It's called Faith and Fury, The Rise of Catholicism During the Civil War. Father, what do you have planned for your next book?
The next book will be, please God, I'll be starting in another month or so, I guess, or less. We're going to, have a third volume beginning in the Gilded Age of the 1880s and taking the story for just about 100 years to the 1980s. I think I will probably finish it during Ronald Reagan's administration when we opened formal diplomatic ties with the Vatican. Going beyond the 1980s, gets a little dangerous because historically, we're not so far removed from the 1980s yet that you can start passing historical judgment very validly, I don't think.
Right. Pretty quickly becomes the present. But definitely check this out. Great history on Catholicism and the Civil War. Thank you so much, Father Charles Connor, for sharing just a little bit of it with us. Appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, Kyle. Very much so.